things. This is all about Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan. And you all heard of them. Of course, I'm not going to talk too much about it. But, whoops, it's not working. Why didn't it work? Go the other way. Patrons ask quite often. I like to talk, but we don't talk about women in aviation enough as far as I'm concerned, especially on a really short tours we do. But Amelia Earhart and her loss is really important to a lot of people. Well, at least they want to know. But interestingly enough, right now there's two investigations going on. One is by this TIGHAR organization, the Historic Group for Aircraft Recovery. And the other one is from the University, Purdue University. And Purdue University owned the airplane. Who knew? It was specially modified for her. They had several tanks to the thing. When they finally took off from Lake New Guinea, they had 1,100 gallons of fuel. Nowadays we measure in weight, and they filled it up when it was hot gas. So in other words, they didn't get as much gas as they could have gotten if it was cold. That's important. So Jacqueline Cochran, of course, we have pretty much a display dedicated to her, and she was best friends with Amelia Earhart. Amelia Earhart, her first attempt, remember, she crashed the airplane, and while it was being repaired, she spent time at Cochran's ranch. And Cochran said, "Don't do this. This is suicide. You're going to fly 2,556 miles across the Pacific Ocean, and you all have flown across the Pacific Ocean one time or another, and you realize all you see is sea out there. And for 2,500 miles, nothing but sea." And he was a master navigator. Okay, he had sailed around the Horn 5 times, twice in sailing ships. He became a commercial pilot, and was actually about to start a navigation school. And he was the lead navigator and helped plan the routes for Pan Am. So he really knew what he was talking about. But they had a lot of problems. They were going to take off at 10 o'clock in the morning. They were supposed to get there at 18,000 GMT, we would call Zulu these days. About 6:30 in the morning, a.m. I would fly all night. There goes celestial navigation because of the fact there was cloud cover the whole way. She was flying 7,000 or 8,000 feet. She didn't really file much of a flight plan except for tell people where she was going. This is her takeoff roll here. She just barely made it. Went off a cliff, dove down behind the cliff, people couldn't see her. Some people saw a cloud of dust come up. They think that was the bottom antenna. We put the HF antenna. Some people think that. Okay, this TIGAR group, or however they say it, they have pages and pages and pages, and there is the reference to where you can find it. You can go on and on. And unfortunately, that's what I've been doing for the last week or so, is just going through all this stuff, trying to figure a lot of this stuff out myself. She didn't have much in the way of, she had a compass, she had a drift meter. You could look out of the bottom of the airplane and see the drift during the day. They had left behind these smoke bombs that it could drop probably every minute or so, and then turn around and come back to see what the actual drift was, or and gauge ground speed. The essence of this whole thing was she was going to fly DR, dead reckoning. She was going to fly a specific length of time based on her speed, ground speed, obviously, not air speed. And the trouble was, the predicted winds were 10 to 15 knots on takeoff, and along the way, about halfway, passing over the Coast Guard cutter Ontario, she was given a new update, which called for winds from 25 to 30. Now, I've flown a whole bunch over oceans and dealt with navigators. Side note, one night in the middle of the night, coming back from Hawaii, it's about 2,500 miles, we're flying along, and the navigator says, "Pilot nav," yeah, he says, "Can you give me 45 left?" And I went, yeah, sure. Here, turn the airplane. A couple minutes go by. "Pilot nav, yeah. Can you give me another 45 degrees left?" Whoa. Anyway.
That's 90 degrees.
And now that's a true story. I've got other navigator stories too. Just like we all have helicopter stories. But okay, he's telling me to hurry up. So now, he didn't have much in the way of navigation, and the other problem was they needed to communicate. That was the other part they were going to. Now here's dead reckoning. I couldn't make that thing to the left, but the way dead reckoning is, you know what the winds are going to be. you have a point in the future. So if you're aiming here, but you aim a little bit to the left because you're going to blow to the right. This is what happened here. There's Howland Island here, which was the destination. Sunrise was coming this way at about 6 o'clock in the morning. They picked out a heading, 157337, southeast. Where did it go? She wanted to cross that line. When she crossed that line, she would turn to the right, theoretically, like right to Howland Island. That line also went right down to this NIKUMORORO, or Gardner Island. So, what actually happened? Her tailwind, slight headwind turned into a heavier headwind. I used to hear the navigators talk about equal time point. At that point in Ontario, she said, the hell with this, and gone back is what she should have done. Because then she would have had a tailwind and would have made it. So, where the whole thing depends on accurate ground speed, which she didn't have. When they got to the Ontario, they must have known they were way behind. And then as she went on, without the sunrise until shortly before they landed, she made a few radio calls. At 7:45 local, she called out, she was 200 miles out. Then half an hour later, she calls out, she's 100 miles out. In other words, they didn't know where they were. Where were they? Nobody seems to know. She didn't know their line of position. Her last call was about 8 o'clock in the morning. She said on the 157337, she was going to repeat the daytime frequency was 6210. I'm saying numbers like I know what they mean. I don't know HF radios.
You have to stop.
I have to stop right now?
Yes, you
okay.
do.
She made it on to, she didn't make it. One last thing. GPT said no, she didn't make it. But you can read all about it. Oh, yeah.
Thanks, Ron.
Sure.
We appreciate it. We're going to talk today about unwrapping a gumdrop, which I didn't know they wrap gumdrops. I thought they came in a box. So, with that, Robert.
You're good.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Robert Megan, one of the docents here. And I'm going to be talking about the Apollo 9 capsule. Okay. The other way. This is our little beauty. This is the gumdrop. Very quickly, this was the first of the Apollo capsules to actually have a call sign, other than just Apollo 7, Apollo 8. They say the reason for this was because you had the lunar module and the command module, but it's not entirely correct. It turns out that the Apollo 7 capsule was supposed to have a call sign too. Wally Schirra wanted it to be Phoenix for obvious reasons. NASA said no, for equally obvious reasons. So, we're going to start by looking inside, because most of our visitors, when they get there, the first thing they do is take a look inside. And the first thing they say is, oh God, look how small it is. Well, it's actually quite large. So, as we're looking at this, it's important to keep your sense of directions. As you look into the spacecraft, you're actually looking down. The coordinates for the spacecraft are from the crew's point of view. We are standing at the top. This is the bottom. This is aft. That is forward. The way the crew would be arranged in here, the commander sits on the left. The command module pilot sits on the right, or in the center. The lunar module pilot sits on the right-hand side. For launch and re-entry, of course, they are lying on their backs with their feet up. The plates there have connections so your boots can lock into them, so your legs don't go flailing around. You are strapped in tightly. There is a scene in the movie Apollo 13 where they're being strapped in, and the suit tech stands on the shoulder of one of the astronauts and pulls the harness tight. That is how they did it. The astronauts who complained about that and loosened them found out what the real problem was, which is every time you stage, you try to meet up with the control panel above you. people talk about all of the controls in here, all of the manual controls, and it's true. Almost everything was manual. So, on the commander's side, behind him to his left, he has controls for the radio, the lights, he has a bunch of circuit breakers, and he has the toggles for turning on and off the reaction control system. There was dual reaction control systems for both the service module and the command module. You could choose to use both, which was the standard way, or if there was a problem, you could switch one or the other. Directly in front of him, his controls concerned launch, the launch vehicle, so he could see what was happening during the launch vehicle. His flight controls, re-entry, he has the re-entry, and then post-landing, landing and post-landing controls. So he is essentially the person flying the craft. To do so, he has two controls. You can see them inside. On the right-hand side, he has what looks like a pretty obvious joystick. This is for rotation control of either the combined vehicles or later on just the single command module. You twist, you tilt, or you rock, and that is your rotation in 3 axes. For translation, there's a little T-shaped handle. It's on the left-hand side. He is the only one with this. The translation moves you forward, moves you backwards, side to side. Obviously, during docking, you need both of these controls. This control is interesting because it has a dual purpose. Up here, it has locked and armed. Right before liftoff, you switched it to armed. At this point, during flight, during the launch, the commander has his hand on this control. If he twists it to the right, it switches the launch vehicle to the backup guidance system. If he switches it to the left, it's the manual abort system. He is the only one on board who can abort during launch. In the center, the command module pilot has obviously the biggest display. He also can reach all the controls on both sides. Not always conveniently, but he can reach them. So he has the DISCI, we'll talk about that in a bit, but that is the interface to the Apollo guidance computer. He has the controls for separation, separating the command module from the lunar module, separating the command module from the service module, separating everything from the launch vehicle. He's got those controls. He also monitors the fuel and pressure for the reaction control system. On the other side, he's dealing with the oxygen and helium, the suit and cabin pressures. He monitors the temperatures of the electronics, the cabin temperature, and down here he's got the controls for the high gain antenna. Over on the right-hand side, the lunar module pilot, he's watching the fuel and oxidizer for the main engine, the big engine at the back. He also has all the electrical systems. So the fuel cells, the electrical system, the radio and tape recorder. The interesting thing about this is the command module pilot would move to the commander's position during docking, undocking. In Apollo 13, in that mission, when things went south, the lunar module pilot and commander were actually busy getting ready to enter the lunar module. Because of that, the command module pilot was in the commander's seat. He reached over, flipped the switch, and that is when the oxygen tank exploded. In order to diagnose the problem, he had to move to this right-hand side because this is where the electrical system was. So he switched seats during that. He also has behind him, again, radio, more lights, more circuit breakers. Now you may notice all 3 of the astronauts have radios to worry about. This gives you an idea where priorities were. There were a lot of radios on board the ship. So we're looking a little bit further down. We're now looking into the aft compartment. The aft compartment down here was for storage. It is where the sample cases went after you came back from the moon. And 2 of the astronauts would sleep underneath there. The 3rd astronaut slept above. Underneath there, you were sleeping in basically a sleeping bag that had tethers on both ends that held you in place. All of the astronauts preferred to sleep underneath when there were 3 astronauts in the cabin. If there was only the command module pilot going around the moon, they always slept on top. Collins reports that he didn't bother strapping in when he was alone in the spacecraft because he kind of liked the feeling of moving around. None of the other command module pilots reported that, which didn't mean they didn't do it, but rather they just saw what happened to Collins when he said he did it. So from that point on, he just didn't mention it. These seats, the seats would fold flat, so you could sleep on them. The feet would fold under to make it easier to get to the bottom of the spacecraft, to the lower equipment bay. Center seat, however, had a couple more tricks to it. The first one was this would actually fold into this weird little seat arrangement. And this was for the astronaut who was doing the guidance and navigation business. The reason for that was it allowed him to lock his feet in place so that when he was busy doing corrections with the rotation system, he wouldn't be launching himself across the spacecraft. Interestingly, in the only photo I could find of an astronaut actually using that system, they were actually seated right there in there. The other thing is the center seat could be taken out and slid under here because if you were doing an EVA through the main hatch, the side hatch, either because of an emergency return or late in the last 3 missions when the command module pilot would get out and take either film back or any samples that were outside the spacecraft. This gave more room to get in and out, and it also allowed someone else to be there to take things from it. The Apollo 9 mission was the first one that was actually tried on. Worked perfectly until, as they were reassembling it afterwards, they discovered that in space, with the temperature changes, the pressure changes, the gravity changes, the spacecraft had flexed ever so slightly. Jamming the hip joint back into place took all 3 of them. The correction for that was very simple. They merely expanded the whole thing by about 1/8 of an inch, gave it a little bit more room, 3 millimeters of room. But this is an example of why no 2 of the Apollo capsules were exactly the same, because every time they came back, they found things that they could improve. For those, by the way, who are engineers, the amazing thing about it is the weight margin never changed. Once they got past the original specifications and actually started building these, even with the improvements that came along, the total weight of the spacecraft never went up. This is a remarkable phenomenon. This has been called out as the most interesting thing by the guy who was in charge of the tracking the weight. The struts here. Oh, by the way, you'll note when you look inside it says for training only. It is my opinion that after the Apollo 9 mission, they took out the frame to see what was wrong with it, discovered the business about the craft shifting in dimensions, and then put this one back in. This is probably one with the corrected spacing. So this is not the seats that flew on that mission. The strut system actually provides a great deal of impact attenuation. This was originally put in when it was thought it would land on land, but it was kept in because it was realized that there was roughly a 1% chance in the case of an abort that they would land on land. The strut system had quite a bit of extension that it could take. The only time it was ever used, that any extension was used, was on Apollo 15, where only 2 of the parachutes opened. And at that time, it moved a total of a quarter of an inch. So once again, this is an example. This was extremely, they thought of everything. It was overbuilt. Guidance and navigation. So looking at the back, at the lower equipment bay, right here in the center is the guidance and navigation system. What you see here is a sextant. It works exactly like a sextant would on Earth. You could use a horizon either on the moon or Earth, aim at a star, a planet, and then recalibrate where the spacecraft thought it was. This is a telescope. This also had the use, you could spot things. When they were looking for example, the upper stage that had already been separated, that's what you would use. Inside of here is the inertial system. This is the inertial navigation system that tracks where the spacecraft thinks it is in space. Over on the left here, there are 2 special gyros, and those are used during re-entry, and that is tracking the re-entry path. One tracks velocity, one tracks position. These 2 open spaces would have held electronics. This open space was a second disk key, because as you were recalibrating the computer, you would be right there to keep typing numbers in. Right here, this rotation controller could be moved to there, so that as you're trying to do a sextant, as you're trying to take your position, you move the craft until it lines up. So what are you programming? There is one computer on board the Apollo spacecraft, the Apollo guidance computer. It is a box about this big. It holds 5K of RAM. It holds 17K of ROM. Your phone holds roughly 1 million times what this guy had. The clocks, your phone's about 1 million times faster. This is the diski. The diski had 3 outputs. They are 5-digit numbers. There's no decimal place. There is no label as to what those numbers mean. Depending upon the program you're running, they could mean anything like weight, they could mean position, they could mean velocity, anything. The program number, you would set the program for what you're trying to do. So if you're doing your guidance calibration, you'd set the program number. If you're doing anything else, re-entry, you'd set the program number. When you're landing on the moon, you had a diski, you'd set the program number for that. The program number for idle was 00. This became known as POO, P00. So if you ever hear anyone talking on any of the audio from the capsule and they talk about POO, this is what they mean, hopefully. Now, I mentioned that it had read-only memory. The read-only memory was core rope memory. So the random access memory was wire core memory, but that is a specific type that's reusable. That's the whole point of it. This type, well, this is interesting because the program was literally woven into it by running wires through little ferrite beads. Somebody actually had to weave the program into place. The cool thing about this is in 2026, there are people who are going around finding all the last of these memories and reading them, and the programs are still there. Why did they do this? Because you could not shift the bits with a random cosmic ray hit. The wire was always there. So how did you keep track of where you were going and what you were doing with a computer that's about as smart as an outlet? The answer is the real-time computing complex. The real-time computing complex was in Houston. It was an entire floor of computers. 5 IBM 360 computers running for 2 weeks. This is the only place on Earth that IBM 360s ran for 2 weeks. What did it mean if I wanted to send an update to the Apollo guidance computer? Well, I'm over on one of the consoles. I send a request down to the real-time computing center and say, I need you guys to give me an update. It would chug along merrily, and when they had one, it would appear on the screens for the flight controller and the computer commander. But when I say appear on the screens, we've all seen the displays that they have in mission control. For this one, there was actually a display down in the real-time computer center with a TV camera pointed at it, because you couldn't run it up to 2 consoles. So that you'd be looking at a TV taking a picture of the screen. If everyone agreed that was correct, it would then go down from the 5 IBM 360s to 3 UNIVAC 464s, which would then double check it and convert it into a message. This would come to the console that is in charge of communication, who would decide where's this going to go. Which of the stations can see this spacecraft at this time? These would then be sent over to the Goddard Space Flight Center, where 3 more computers would say, okay, we got this. This is easy, no problem. We're now going to send the message over a dial-up modem to whichever station can see it. So let's say Canberra. But you know, things get screwed up. So we're also going to send that same message by teletype. It will come out on paper tape. They could feed the paper tape in if something goes wrong. It then goes, for example, to Canberra, where a computer, yet another computer, takes a look at this and says, okay, this is good. We're ready to send. At this point, they would contact the spacecraft and say, we have an update. In the spacecraft, you would turn the computer to the mode which would allow an update. This was very specific because they were worried about the Soviets sending false data to the spacecraft.
Oh, wow.
It would then upload to the spacecraft and would appear on the disk key as if it were being typed in. This was a form of redundancy. If there was a problem with the high-speed communication, you could read the numbers to the crew and they could manually type it in. But there was also the chance that you didn't have audio communications either. For this case, in each spacecraft, there were slide rules and calculation sheets, and the guys could do it themselves and type it in. What's more, during training, the astronauts walking down the hall would be randomly grabbed, shoved into a room, handed a packet with the problem and a slide rule, and told, go to it. You have 6 minutes. No pressure. So, having had some fun inside, let's look at how it's constructed. What we see on the outside is heat shields. It's all heat shield. There was a forward heat shield. We don't have this because it came off just before the parachutes opened. There's a crew compartment heat shield, and then there is the aft heat shield. Inside of that, we have the inner structure. The inner structure is actually the pressure vessel for the vehicle. It's a cylinder, once again with a truncated cone on top. There is a flat bulkhead, and then there's the docking tunnel. The construction of the inner structure is you have 2 sheets of aluminum sandwiching an aluminum honeycomb. The thickness of that honeycomb varied depending on where on the ship you were at. At the back, thicker. At the front, thinner. Docking tunnel, thinnest of all. The inside sheet of that sandwich was welded together to make the shell. This was then anodized and fittings were installed. So all the brackets and everything that would be used were installed at this point. Then the aluminum honeycomb was put in place. And the outer sheets were added. The sandwich was literally glued together. And so the next step was to stick it into an autoclave under vacuum and basically glue the whole thing together. The rear inner structure was done the same way, just upside down. Including putting in all of the brackets. Brackets, once again, were glued in place. No through fasteners. Then these two were put together. You have the lower and the upper assemblies. They were welded together, and the external to the inner structures were put in place. And this is what holds the fuel tanks, the oxygen tanks, the water tanks, the batteries for the command module. After that, you had your insulation. It was fiberglass insulation. It was not asbestos. We get that question. The batteries, everything you can see being put all the way around, and the windows were put in place. Internal equipment was installed, and now we'll go to the heat shield. The heat shield's construction was very similar, except it was a stainless steel sandwich this time. 2 inches thick for the aft heat shield, and then 6/10 of an inch thick for the others. Once that was assembled, a phenolic honeycomb was applied all around. For those of you who don't know, phenolic is a cloth that's impregnated with resin. It's very stiff, very brittle, but also doesn't conduct electricity, is terrible or a terrific insulator. These sheets were just stuck to it using, again, an adhesive tape. This was then milled to give the desired shape. Thus begins now we have to fill them. So, mixing up an epoxy mixture that included glass fibers and very tiny hollow beads of phenolic to lighten it. This was then applied into the individual cells, 370,000 individual cells, one at a time, by hand. You can only imagine. I mean, it was a co-ed activity, as you see. The thickness varied. So, at the point that was going to take the most heat, 2.7 inches thick. Thinning to 2 inches on the heat shield, then 1 inch tapering up to 3/4 of an inch going up. This was then put back on the lathe and milled again, because of course you can't precisely fill all those honeycomb cells. Now, those of you who've known me long enough to know when I started this project have known that there's certain things that drove me insane because I wanted to find out what they were. We're going to say not now, if you don't mind. Boy, that was nice to pop up with an okay. You see these weird little circles with dots in the middle, all the way around the heat shield. I had a suspicion what they were, but I really wanted to find an actual reference in the documentation, and I did. In TechNote D7564, it says, the machine TPS is radiographed to detect any defects in the ablator, and repairs are made if necessary. All of these pieces would be x-rayed if there were any air voids. They would be drilled out and refilled. If you look closely, you will notice there are more of these repairs in the areas where it's thickest. That makes sense. It's hard to push the epoxy all the way to the bottom. You'll also notice that there's overlapping ones. My suspicion, and I have not found documentation for this, my suspicion is that in these areas, there was something going on with delamination, probably of the honeycomb at the bottom. And so getting all the little bits filled in took several tries. I have no idea why there's a little dot in the center. It probably has something to do with how it was injected in. So, now we get to Jerry's question about how you wrap a drug product. So the very first thing, the first thing to say is, if you look at photos of the other command modules, ours looks the rattiest. Everyone else has nice brown ones, they're all even colored, they all look great. Ours looks like it was a rental turned back after a wild weekend. There's a reason. So the first thing they did was apply a layer of epoxy sealant to the whole thing. For all of the command modules up to 9. They would then apply a layer of primer and a layer of paint. The concern was the bare epoxy would absorb moisture. What they found out was that is not true. It did not absorb moisture. They were able to save the weight of the paint by not putting those 2 layers on. You go, well, how much weight is that? Well, even if it's 30 pounds, 2 coats, this is 30 pounds you're pushing to the moon and back. This is weight that could be used for something useful. There are also the big gap between the aft heat shield and the crew compartment heat shield, and around all of the panels, there's a brown substance in there. That brown substance is RTV rubber, room temperature vulcanized rubber. It's the sort of sealant you would use today. It didn't burn. It was flexible. It remained sufficiently flexible. So the aft compartment and the crew compartment were just bolted together. They were not welded. And that was how you filled the voids. Then, after it was painted, ready to leave the factory, it got wrapped in a glue protective wrapper. And this is where the gumdrop paint came from. Hopefully removed before flight. It then went to the Kennedy Space Flight Center, where it was mated with the command module and then mated to the launch vehicle. Still all wrapped in blue. Only then was the blue wrap removed and the Kapton tape put on. That is aluminum Kapton tape, aluminized Kapton tape. Was designed to reflect as much of the incoming energy as possible. It reflected about 40% of that energy. This was to help control the temperature within the spacecraft. It also was god-awful fragile. So this is literally the only photo I was able to find of an assembled spacecraft with the Kapton tape on the ground. Because as soon as they did that, they immediately put the boost protective cover on it to protect it. So, looking at windows in the hatch was the biggest change from the Apollo 1 fire. The single biggest change. There were thousands of little changes, but the number one change was the hatch. Why? Well, the original hatch took 30 seconds to unlock. It also weighed 300 pounds and had 3 different components. Getting it open without outside help was extremely difficult. The new hatch weighs 225 pounds, and then when the cover is in place, that cover additionally weighs another 125 pounds. This hatch could be unlocked in 3 seconds. Egress for all 3 crew members was now 30 seconds. So the time to get people out was shorter than the time it took to unlock the original hatch. To do that, a couple things were required. Number one was, as soon as you were in and ready for launch, you would actually arm it for a quick escape. In doing so, there was a spring compressed And the first pump would actually blow the outside cover open through a spring-loaded plunger that would unlock it. It took 5 pumps to get it open, and now it was unlocked. But you still have 350 pounds of door. Down here, underneath this, there are 2 nitrogen-filled gas cylinders. These cylinders are like you find on your automobile hood or anything else. They push the weight out. There's 2 because it was designed to be open in flight. And in order to do so, you would want to turn it down so it didn't slam open. And then after you vented it, when your EVA was concluded, you would rearm it. When you read the literature for this, there's this beautiful line. Actually, it was in a video, one of the closeout videos. This beautiful line where they were talking about this, and they said, and this allows the hatch to be opened and closed conveniently by one person inside or outside the spacecraft. At that time, they now show somebody closing out the spacecraft. There are 3 techs, all of whom are leaning on the hatch to get it shut. This thing was going to open. The actual instructions for it, this is the emergency procedure page. Number 1, just make sure that it's set to unlatch. It should have been, but make sure. Grab the handle and pump 5 times. This will take less than 3 seconds. The command module pilot's job to do this. I can imagine if you were on fire, this would take a lot less than 3 seconds to do 5 pumps. That is the complete instructions for getting out. There are 5 windows on the spacecraft. There are 2 side windows, those are the big rectangular ones. There are the 2 rendezvous windows that look up. And then there's a window in the hatch. These windows all had the same basic construction. The construction was a double pane window in the pressure vessel, in the inner structure. This was about anywhere from 0.2 to 0.25, depending on which window, of an inch of aluminum silicate glass. This is very tough glass. This is the predecessor of what we now call Gorilla Glass, the stuff that they make phone screens out of. So you can imagine how a 1/4 inch of that's going to take a lot of impact. The outer piece of glass was mounted in the heat shield. It was part of the heat shield structure. It was designed to protect from the heat. It was designed to protect from micrometeor hits. It was 3/4 of an inch of fused silica, essentially quartz. These were coated with anti-reflection coatings. On the outside, there was a magnesium fluoride coating. This is the sort of thing you get on camera lenses. It helps prevent glare. And then there was what they called the blue-red coating. This limited the amount of infrared and ultraviolet light that could come through the capsule. It's interesting to read the Apollo experience reports. These were written in the early 1970s to capture lessons learned. The one talking about the window says, our number 1 problem. We did the windows with the assumption that they were part of the structure. And we had structural engineers figure everything out, and that was great. We tested the windows for strength, everything was perfect. But you know, we never actually thought about the fact it's glass. And glass is a special material. Going forward, it'd be really good to have somebody who knows something about glass on this thing. What were the problems? Well, a lot of assumptions were made that if everything worked just fine without the coatings, with the coatings, it'd be just as fine. Until they had to clear off a couple of these side windows because they wanted to do photography that had ultraviolet and infrared. So they had to clear off those coatings that had been put on it. What they discovered was, as they heated it up to get rid of the coatings, the glass shattered. It turns out that the coatings would craze, and that would transmit into the glass. Oh, not good. So, these were little features. The rendezvous window also has markings. They're visible from the inside if you are very tall and you stand tippy-toe and you peer in. You can just barely see them on the outside. Now, something to realize is on our capsule, we only have the outer windows on the two big side windows. The rendezvous window and the hatch window do not have their outer window. There's a reason. They didn't get lost. These windows would be taken off and microscopically examined after each mission to see if there had been any hits by micrometeors, and if so, how much damage did they do? The answer was disappointingly little for the guys who really cared about this. Only about half of the windows actually showed any hits at all, and the hits were just microscopic. Vents and ports. Vents and ports, over on the left side, as you're looking at the spacecraft from the outside, there's a port that's labeled steam. Steam? Steam. The electronics in here were cooled with a glycol cooler that had a radiator. And if the radiator started getting hot, wastewater could be sprayed onto it to evaporate, take the steam off. And so it would vent steam. There are two ports down here, and on the rather nice little sign that explains what all the ports are, they point out that this one is water. This one didn't get labeled. Don't ask me why. Ours are missing two not at all weird looking caps over those two ports. These ports were actually, or these caps were actually heaters to keep them from freezing up. This is from the Apollo 11 spacecraft. It still has them. You can see how they could get knocked off pretty easily during handling. Also, because it's easier to see here, this is also the Apollo 11 capsule. The place where the sign is mounted that says "Don't touch" is actually the sea anchor mount. So, in your spacecraft, you've landed, you're now drifting away, you open the hatch, you toss out a sea anchor and hook it to this, and that slows your drift rate. There's also an air vent port over on that side as well. And here you can see the handles that were used for the EVAs, whether for the emergency EVA or for getting the goodies from the back. These are off. You can find all these screw holes for them. Around the back of the spacecraft. The spacecraft was designed to come in with one side leading. And because of that, almost nothing is back here. You protect the windows, you protect the doors because they're the most vulnerable areas, and you make this as plain as possible. Okay, I said that they said our first problem was we didn't have a glass expert. The second problem was, and it literally says this, we didn't have 5 windows, we had 9. There were 3 on the sextant. There was 1 on the telescope. These were never tested. Why? These are instruments. The instrument group didn't test. They didn't have the same requirements. This was noted as a lesson learned. As it turns out, afterwards, they did go back and test them and found out that they were more than adequate, but nobody knew that. The good news, and this is literally listed as the good news, is if one of them had blown out, it would not have violated the amount of space that would be needed, or it would not have caused enough evacuation fast enough, the astronauts couldn't have gotten into their spacesuits. Doesn't sound like good news to me, but hey, you take what you get. At the bottom is the belly button. What? This is the umbilical. You have to get all of the air, fuel, electric, water, and command signals to and from the service module. And no one gets to go out and unplug that when the time comes. So you have this umbilical. It's in a container. This is a photo of our mock-up, and you can see how it comes down here along the side of the aircraft or the spacecraft. You'll notice it is slightly offset from 180 degrees so that the reaction control thruster doesn't impinge directly upon it. And it's in this case. So what happens when it's time to separate? Well, first of all, this is what it looks inside, the bundle with all the hoses, wires, connections. When the time comes to separate, mention that there is the command module, service module separation switch. You flip it. Within 80 microseconds, there are booms everywhere. The first boom is there are guillotine blades that will slice up and down through that. You only need one that would make it all the way through, but there was redundancy. These were fired by redundant charges as well. So it would literally just blast a knife right through, cutting all those hoses, wires, and everything else. At the same time, the explosive bolts holding the two spacecraft together the nuts would detonate, allowing the spacecraft to drift apart. And the umbilical would swing back under spring pressure. So now we're underneath the spacecraft. Mention we are sitting on the service module. There are 6 fiberglass pads that it's sitting on. 3 of those pads had these connecting bolts. Where are they now? Well, interestingly, those 3 are where we are holding up the spacecraft. Why? Well, these are the places that were designed to support the weight of the craft. This is the strongest load path through the spacecraft. So, there were little circles taken out all the way around. This was another scavenger hunt trying to find out what these were. It turns out that these spacecraft would be returned to North American, and that they would do core samples. This was done all the way through, beginning with the first Apollo launch, which was 4, and continuing on. There is actually a procedure for how many are to be taken and everything. As of Apollo 12, this was to be discontinued. It was not. They continued all the way to the end. These core samples found their way into the hands of executives, connected companies, politicians, all these sorts of people. You can find them on the collector's market. Here's one from Apollo 9. It does allow you to see how it's charred at the top, how it's devolatilized underneath that, and it's still intact at the bottom. This is the bottom, there is the top. On one of the early craft, it may have been a 4, it may have been 5, a big chunk was cut out of the bottom. This is now at the Air and Space Museum, this is their photo, but you can see the stainless steel honeycomb, the ablator, and the condition it's in. Re-entry. Almost there, guys. Almost there. So, taking a look at this, we have reaction control thrusters here, here, and at the top. Somebody just asked me over the weekend, what is the coolest thing you can tell me about the spacecraft that nobody thinks to ask? I said, you don't fall to Earth, you surf. Surf. When you're surfing, you're standing at the back of the surfboard. Your center of gravity is behind the center of lift. You want to go right, you lean, you go that way. You want to go left, you lean, you go that way. You want to go faster, you lean forward, now you're sliding more. You want to slow down, you lean back, now you're pushing. That is how the spacecraft worked. These were designed to correct track, right or left. You're going too far, you push with this one, tilt it back, you have more drag, less lift. Not far enough, you lean forward, you go farther. You'll notice that these are the most heavily used, that is next most heavily used, these, and then these on the side were not used at all. That's just how it worked. Coming back down after you re-enter, at 24,000 feet, the good stuff happens. First, the forward apex cover comes off, the heat shield. Now parachutes start opening. 2 parachutes fired out of the mortars on the top, They are roughly 14-foot diameter, very long cords. They convert you from sliding through the air to falling down, and they prevent you from tumbling. From that moment on, everything is timed. A few seconds later, they pop off. Then, 3 small motors fire 6-foot parachutes. These are the pilot parachutes that pull the main parachutes out. To show you, when we were watching, my wife and I were watching the Artemis return, she looked at me and said, "Why are you counting?" And I said, 3, 2, 1, shoots. And things would happen within a second or two of the Apollo timing. That's how similar these are. These are the parachutes. There were 3 people who were allowed to pack parachutes. Each parachute took about a week to pack. The 3 people were not allowed to travel in the same vehicle. That was actually a rule. The parachutes, after being folded, were put into a hydraulic press and pressed for 3 days until they reached the density of maple. That's how they got them in that space. We can see that up here, this is where the drogues came from. This is one of the parachute compartments. Parachute, you just saw it, would have been sitting here. Underneath here was the flotation device, the uprighting device. You see, a cone like this can float 2 ways, stable 1 or stable 2. Stable 2 is your head down. Coincidentally, half of the spacecraft landed in each configuration. This one's a little awkward, so there were 3 bags that were filled by a compressor that could upright the spacecraft. That hoop right here is not for lifting the spacecraft up. It is an alternative in case the bags didn't work. The helicopter could drop a hook and that would flip it back up. And questions, and I'm 2 minutes over. I'm sorry.
Great job, Robert. I have one about the abort handle you talked about.
Yeah.
Abort when? Like you could turn the candle off, or?
During launch, you have the launch escape tower on top of you. If something started going wrong, there were automatic triggers that would abort, but if the commander felt that there was a problem that wasn't getting addressed, he literally could turn 17 degrees counterclockwise, the launch escape tower would fire, and their mission was over.
Okay.
What's the diameter of the main chute?
The main chute, and it's always tricky with parachutes what the diameter is, but the number usually given is 67 feet. It opened in stages too, so you didn't get the big jerk. Fred?
Given the fact that the original Apollo 1 door took 30 seconds
Yeah, to unlock.
to unlock, if they had had the redesigned door, would they still been able, they would not have been able to get out?
They believe they would have. They actually believe that they would have. And they drilled against that time.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
unfortunately, no, but
Right.
that was the objective that they set.
You were assuming that they weren't buttoned down tight like they were before. I mean,
Well, even if they were,
Yeah.
getting undone was very quick.
yeah, but it's oxygen.
And so
Yeah.
they knew how long the fire took to ignite, and they had the timing on that very closely.
Okay.
Mike?
That middle seat that you were able, how did that work? Did that slide underneath that, the seat to the left lifted up and it slid under, and how did that work?
So actually, you disconnected at the hips, you disconnected at the top. There's 2 pins you can really see at the top. You would slide it under. The cover for the docking hatch, you would put in between, and then there were straps that you would pull up tight. So you pushed it up against the commander's seat. So you actually took it out, slid it under, and then jacked it up with the straps.
So the Capcom tape, I was told that some of the Capcom tape was removed by frogmen for souvenirs. Is there any remaining on our Apollo 9?
Yes, there is. The door has quite a bit, and there are small pieces going around. If you look online, there are people who claim to be selling it. It doesn't look right. And the reason is it was so insanely thin that peeling it off did not give you something that just crumbled. There was no flexibility left.
But the way that, if you look at the power module, which is command module, which is all kinds of different things. Some of it's paint, some of it's primer, some of it's epoxy, but some of it looks like it probably would be the Kapton tape.
So, right, there is definitely some left. On the back, it's all gone. You can easily see that. But as you get, especially up near the top over the hatch, there's definitely some there because it took less of the aerodynamic load.
How do they control the environment?
Ah.
Air sucking machine?
For temperature or?
And pressurization and all that?
The pressurization was actually pretty easy. So they had the oxygen under pressure and they would always be feeding oxygen in. So maintaining the pressure, this was kept at 5 psi. That was the standard pressure. And that was fairly easy. Maintaining temperature was hard at the beginning. They actually did full-size, full-scale testing of the entire stack, the command module and service module, in a vacuum chamber with astronauts inside for 2 weeks to monitor the temperature and humidity and everything to see what would happen. They had problems. The electronics generated a lot of heat. This is why when Apollo 13 came back with no electrics, they got so cold, because that was providing most of the heat. And there was no heater to generate it. So the cooling was essentially external. But one of the things they did was, during the mission, people asked, well, which way were they pointing? Well, the answer was they were rotating slowly. They called it the rotisserie roll. And that way the craft heated evenly, so you didn't have hot spots and cold spots. Yeah. Anything? Yes, sir.
Did they use the sextant as a matter of routine?
I'm sorry, they used
The sextant for star navigation?
Yes. So it was, there would be, I think it was one on each leg coming back at the start of each leg, and to basically recalibrate the system. But there were also examples of them doing it specifically for research purposes.
And did that update the INS then? Or?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So there's actually the whole documentation for it, and it's awful. Just reading through it, it's just awful.
So in terms of the astronauts learning all the different switches,
Yes.
I was told that they had to learn all the switches, but that wherever your seating was where you specifically concentrated, and that was, I mean, that was demonstrated on Apollo 12.
Yeah. It seems to me, and I can't say for a fact, but it seems to me that you would probably have memorized muscle memory where every switch was in front of you. You may have to go looking for a label for one that was way off to the side. But if it was your problem, I'm willing to bet it was muscle memory for most of
Because
it.
that's what happened with Apollo 12, is it was
Yep. The lightning strike.
whoever was on the extreme right side,
The lunar module pilots. Yeah.
the lunar module pilot, flipped the switch to reach.
Okay, thank you, Robert.
Yep.
Well done.
Okay, the next section is going to